It happened during an ordinary dinner, the kind you agree to because it's Friday and you're supposed to still be social. We were at a friend's place in Austin, warm light, loud plates, a bottle of red that wasn't meant to be analyzed. Lauren sat across from me, posture perfect, smile practiced. The couples around us were relaxed in that easy way people get when they think their lives are stable. I reached for a napkin, just a napkin, and she corrected me like I grabbed the wrong file off a conference table. "No, not that one," she said, sharp enough to cut through the chatter. I paused, half laughing out of habit, like it was a joke I was supposed to catch and return. I asked which one, quiet, polite. Then the sauce came out. Someone passed a small bowl, and one set it near my plate. Lauren's eyes narrowed. "Why would you put it there?" she snapped, louder now. "It's like you don't think." The room went still in a way you can feel on your skin. Forks slowed. A friend's wife blinked and looked down at her glass. Somebody cleared their throat and didn't follow it with words. Lauren kept going. Wrong napkin, wrong sauce, wrong tone, stacking tiny complaints like they were proof of something bigger. It wasn't about dinner. It was about control. About making sure everyone understood where I ranked. I could have defended myself. I could have made it into a laugh. I'd done both before. But something in me stayed quiet, not from fear, just recognition. I looked at her and saw it clearly. She wasn't embarrassed. She wasn't impulsive. She was comfortable. So I said nothing. I let the silence do what it does. And in that moment, with our friends pretending not to watch and Lauren sitting there like she'd won something, I felt a clean break inside me, like a line finally snapped. Not anger, not grief, just certainty. Something had broken for good, and there wasn't a way back. We lived in Austin, in a house that looked like stability from the street. Limestone facade, clean landscaping, the kind of place that showed well in listing photos. Inside, everything matched because Lauren made sure it matched. Whites, creams, pale wood, a few black accents so it didn't feel basic. There were candles on the shelves that never got lit. Bowls that were too expensive to put anything in. It wasn't a home so much as a display of a home. I built commercial real estate, small to mid-sized projects, the unglamorous stuff that keeps a growing city stitched together. Strip centers, medical offices, flex warehouses. My work was concrete schedules and loan covenants, tenant improvements and inspections. I liked it because numbers didn't pretend. A budget either balanced or it didn't. A slab either cured or it cracked. If a deal went bad, you could trace it back to decisions and dates and signatures. Lauren sold lifestyle. That was the word she used, like she was offering something intangible and rare. She worked with wealthy clients, women mostly, helping them curate their lives the way you curate a brand. Interior consultations, wardrobe refreshes, boutique partnerships, event planning, private shopping. It sounded frivolous when you said it plainly, but she knew how to wrap it in language that made it seem essential. She talked about elevating and editing and alignment. She could turn a new set of dishes into a moral achievement. For a long time, I told myself the difference between us was just temperament. I was practical. She was particular. She cared about impressions because impressions mattered in her world. I accepted that the house had to be ready for photos at all times. I accepted that people's names had to be remembered, titles included, and that a certain level of charm was non-negotiable. I accepted that she would rewrite stories in real time to make them land better. I even accepted the small digs, because I didn't want to be the guy who couldn't take a joke. Over the years the small things became a pattern. The sharp tone when I didn't respond fast enough. The look of disgust when I wore something she didn't pick. The way she'd correct me in public, softly at first, like she was helping, like she was saving me from myself. Then harder when she realized no one would stop her. She was rarely satisfied. If we went somewhere nice, she found what wasn't nice enough. If we hosted, she counted who came and who didn't. If I closed a deal, she asked why it wasn't bigger. I learned to present good news like a draft, waiting for edits. And I helped build it. I kept upgrading things because it seemed easier than addressing the tone underneath. New patio furniture, a bigger vacation, a better restaurant. I told myself we were just in a phase. That we were busy. That marriage had seasons. I said it so often I started to believe it. But after that dinner, the phrase, "just her personality," stopped working. Personality didn't explain contempt. Personality didn't explain how comfortable she was making me small. I'd been calling it stability because the bills were paid and the calendars were full. Under the surface, it was something else. It was performance. And I finally saw that I'd been cast as a supporting role. After that dinner, I didn't confront her. I didn't bring it up on the drive home or circle back to it the next morning. I didn't even replay it out loud in my head the way people usually do when they're preparing an argument. Something in me decided, quietly and without discussion, that reacting was no longer useful. Instead, I started listening. Not the way you listen when you're waiting for your turn to speak, or when you're trying to steer the conversation somewhere safer. I listened the way you listen when you're no longer invested in the outcome. I paid attention to phrasing, timing, repetition. I noticed what she emphasized and what she skipped. I noticed how often we became I when she talked about success, and how quickly I became you when something needed blame. Patterns surfaced fast once I stopped interrupting them with hope. I saw how every interaction had an audience in mind, even when no one else was present. How she adjusted stories depending on who was listening, sanding off details that didn't flatter her role. How disagreement wasn't something to resolve, but something to win. When I offered a different perspective, she didn't respond to it, she reframed it, then dismissed the version she'd created. I realized I wasn't a partner in her life. I was context, set dressing, proof of credibility. I existed to confirm the image she wanted reflected back at her. When I aligned with that image, things were smooth. When I didn't, friction appeared immediately, like a warning light. What unsettled me wasn't anger. It was how clean the realization felt. There was no spike of adrenaline, no surge of resentment. Just a steady awareness, the same kind you get when you realize a deal was never viable and you're relieved you caught it before signing. The emotional drama I'd expected never showed up. In its place was clarity. I stopped explaining myself, not as a tactic, just because the explanations no longer had a destination. I let conversations end where they landed. I answered questions directly and didn't decorate the answers. I watched how often silence made her uncomfortable, how quickly she filled it with criticism or urgency. She noticed the change, but misread it. She thought I was tired, distracted. She suggested vacations, new routines, a reset. I nodded when appropriate and declined when I didn't feel like going along. I didn't argue. I didn't correct her assumptions. I let her build theories without input. At night, lying next to her, I felt strangely alert. Not anxious, awake, like someone who'd been driving on autopilot and finally put both hands on the wheel. The marriage hadn't exploded. Nothing dramatic had happened, but the story I'd been telling myself about it had ended. And once that story was gone, everything else became easier to see. The heart attack came without drama, which felt appropriate. No cinematic collapse, no warning speech. Just pressure, heat, a sudden narrowing of everything that mattered. One moment I was reviewing emails at the kitchen counter. The next I was sitting on the floor trying to decide whether this was pain or inconvenience. By the time the ambulance arrived, I already knew it wasn't negotiable. In the hospital, after the tests and the quiet efficiency of people who deal with consequences for a living, the doctor spoke plainly. He said my arteries weren't the story. Stress was. Long-term, unmanaged, normalized stress. The kind you explain away because it doesn't leave marks. He asked about work. I answered honestly. He asked about sleep. I hesitated. Then he asked about my marriage, and I gave a non-answer that sounded practiced even to me. He didn't push. He didn't need to. Recovery was slow enough to force stillness. Days blurred into routines built around medication schedules and short walks. Lauren visited, attentive in a way that felt performative. She updated people, organized meals, told the story with concern calibrated for the listener. I watched her do it with the same detached focus I brought to stalled projects. I noted what was emphasized and what was skipped. I didn't think about saving the marriage. That surprised me. There was no internal debate, no list of pros and cons. The idea simply didn't arise. Instead, something quieter took its place. A decision to stop living in a way that required constant justification. I wasn't angry. I wasn't planning an exit. I was just done participating in a system that taxed me every day and called it normal. I complied with everything on the surface. I thanked people. I followed instructions. I reassured Lauren when she asked if I was okay. But internally, a line had been crossed. Not dramatically, irreversibly. The urgency I used to feel about fixing things evaporated. Problems that once demanded immediate attention now registered as optional. I started thinking in terms of margins. Energy margins, time margins, how much of each I was willing to spend, and on what. I stopped volunteering explanations. I stopped absorbing her moods as my responsibility. When she complained, I listened without absorbing. When she criticized, I acknowledged without correcting. From the outside, nothing changed. We returned to routine. Work resumed. Social obligations reappeared. But inside, I had already stepped back. I wasn't preparing for confrontation or escape. I was preparing for a different way of being, one that didn't require permission. The heart attack didn't scare me into gratitude. It clarified something simpler. Whatever came next needed to be lighter, quieter, built on choices instead of endurance. And whether the marriage survived that shift was no longer the point. For 6 months, I watched. Not in a suspicious way, not with the hunger of someone looking for a smoking gun. I watched the way you watch weather patterns when you already know the season has changed. Calm, patient, interested only in accuracy. I noticed how she spoke to service workers when she thought no one important was listening. How politeness was optional when there was nothing to gain. I noticed how decisions were made quickly when they benefited her image and endlessly delayed when they involved inconvenience. Consequences existed only as abstract concepts, things that happened to other people or much later, when they could be explained away. I paid attention to money. Not because I suspected anything dramatic, but because money always tells the truth eventually. I reviewed accounts, spending rhythms, how often business expenses blurred into personal ones. I didn't accuse. I didn't question. I just documented. Statements, dates, patterns. I treated it the way I treated any asset that required clarity. I watched how she talked about me when I wasn't in the room. Not directly, through reflections. Stories repeated back slightly altered. Compliments with sharp edges. The subtle repositioning where my role shrank and hers expanded. It wasn't malicious. It was habitual. Like breathing. At home, tension thickened, but only internally. Outwardly, I was steady. Predictable. I handled logistics. I showed up when required. I stopped offering emotional labor. When she asked what was wrong, I said nothing was. That wasn't a lie. Nothing was wrong. Something was simply ending. I put my life in order quietly. Updated documents. Consolidated accounts. Made copies of things that mattered and stored them where I could access them without friction. I spoke to an attorney once, briefly, not for strategy but for confirmation. I wanted to know what clean looked like. What calm separation required. The answer was preparation, not confrontation. She sensed distance and responded the only way she knew how, by escalating performance. More plans. Bigger gestures. Public displays that looked like closeness from the outside. I participated without investing. I didn't sabotage. I didn't resist. I let her do what she always did when control felt threatened. At night, I slept better than I had in years. My body felt lighter, even as the air between us grew heavier. The irony wasn't lost on me. The stress I'd been warned about wasn't coming from silence. It had come from pretending. By the end of those 6 months, nothing explosive had happened. No revelations. No confessions. Just a complete internal accounting. I knew exactly where I stood, what I was responsible for, and what I was no longer willing to carry. The tension remained contained, folded neatly inside me. And that was the point. The divorce was quiet. No spectacle, no scorched earth. Just signatures, timelines, and a series of administrative endings that felt more procedural than emotional. Lauren framed it publicly as a mutual evolution. I didn't correct her. I didn't need to. The truth didn't require my participation anymore. Within weeks of finalizing things, I left the country. Not to disappear, not to reinvent myself, just to breathe somewhere neutral. Valencia offered that. Sunlight without urgency. Streets that didn't ask who you were or what you did. A rhythm built around meals, walking, and time passing without commentary. I rented a small place near the water and let my days narrow down to essentials. I didn't follow her life closely, but news travels on its own. Mutual contacts. Social media echoes. Lauren remarried quickly. Faster than most people expected, faster than even she had hinted at. The wedding was public, polished, heavily documented. A new man, positioned confidently at her side, smiling in a way that suggested certainty rather than intimacy. What struck me wasn't jealousy or bitterness. It was familiarity. The cadence of the announcements. The language. The way everything was presented as inevitable, elevated, aligned. The same words she'd used with me in the early years, before tone replaced warmth. I recognized the structure immediately: the accelerated closeness, the public validation, the certainty offered before substance had time to form. I watched from a distance, detached enough to notice details without assigning meaning. The posts were frequent. The praise was broad and non-specific. The future was referenced constantly, as if repetition could substitute for foundation. It wasn't my concern anymore, but pattern recognition doesn't turn off just because the subject changes. Valencia gave me space to recalibrate. I worked remotely, selectively. I kept my needs small. Mornings were quiet. Evenings were unremarkable in the best way. No one corrected my tone. No one edited my presence. I existed without being evaluated. When people asked about my past, I kept it brief. A marriage, a transition, a move, no commentary. The absence of explanation felt like a privilege I'd earned. From time to time, I thought about how quickly she'd rebuilt the image of stability. Not with resentment, but with curiosity. How much of it was momentum, how much was necessity? But those questions belonged to someone else's life now. I didn't feel like I'd escaped something. I felt like I'd stepped out of a system that required constant performance and into one that didn't require anything at all. And as her new story unfolded publicly, I stayed where I was, quiet, grounded, and no longer part of the narrative. The contact didn't come from her. It came sideways, the way most real disruptions do. A former colleague reached out, casual, almost hesitant, asking if I'd heard about the wedding. I said yes, that I hoped everything had gone smoothly. There was a pause in the exchange, the kind that suggests a follow-up someone hasn't decided to send yet. When it came, it was phrased as curiosity, not concern. Apparently, there had been a moment during the reception. Nothing loud, nothing disruptive, just a man who wasn't on the seating chart. He wasn't family. He wasn't part of the friend group. No one could place him. He showed up alone, dressed appropriately, confident without being showy. He didn't hover. He didn't introduce himself broadly. He waited. When the toasts began, he stood when it was his turn, as if his name had been called. No one stopped him. People assumed someone else had vetted him. That's how these things work: authority by posture, legitimacy by calm. His toast was brief, measured. He spoke about timing, about clarity, about how stories don't end just because we decide to start new ones. There was no accusation in his voice. No bitterness. Just precision. Each sentence landed cleanly, without flourish. The room didn't erupt. It didn't collapse into chaos. It simply shifted. Faces tightened. Smiles froze halfway through their assignments. Someone laughed too late. Someone else stopped smiling altogether. Lauren stood still. Not shocked. Calculating. The man finished, nodded once, and left. No confrontation. No explanation. Just absence. I wasn't there, but I could picture it easily. I knew the type. Calm isn't accidental. It's cultivated. Whoever he was, he hadn't come for closure or validation. He'd come to place something in the open and let it exist on its own. I didn't reach out. I didn't ask questions. I didn't clarify anything for anyone. Whatever had been set in motion didn't require my involvement. That was the most unfamiliar part for me. Watching a situation unfold without feeling responsible for managing it. Later, someone asked if I knew him. I said no, and that was true. Someone else asked if I thought it meant anything. I said I didn't know, and that was also true. But privately, I understood the mechanics. When a system is built on controlled narratives, it doesn't take much to destabilize it. Just one unaccounted variable. One voice that doesn't follow the script. I stayed silent. Not out of restraint, but because silence was finally honest. Whatever followed belonged to them now. I had already stepped out of the structure where I was expected to absorb the shock. The encounter wasn't dramatic. It was surgical. And it didn't need me at all. After the wedding, things didn't explode. They unraveled. At first it showed up as confusion, not scandal. Questions asked quietly, then repeated. Timelines that didn't align the way they were supposed to. Stories that had sounded confident when delivered publicly started to wobble when examined privately. Nothing dramatic. Just friction where things were meant to slide. People noticed changes in Lauren's tone. Less certainty. More explanation. The polished summaries gave way to longer versions that tried too hard to resolve themselves. She began correcting narratives midstream, revising details that had already been accepted as fact. That kind of backtracking always draws attention, even from people who don't care to investigate. The new marriage didn't fail loudly. It strained. Pressure showed up in logistics first: missed events, altered plans, sudden travel. The image stayed intact online, but the offline version started developing seams. Mutual friends felt it before they understood it. They described it as tension without a source, discomfort without an argument. Facts surfaced slowly, the way they usually do when no one is forcing them out. Someone remembered something they hadn't questioned before. Someone else connected two details that hadn't mattered until now. The man at the wedding remained unnamed, but his presence lingered. Not as a threat, more like a reference point. A reminder that not everything had been disclosed. I stayed out of it completely. No commentary. No triangulation. When asked what I thought, I said nothing or very little. That wasn't discipline. It was disinterest. I had already processed my part of the story, and revisiting it wouldn't have added clarity. What struck me most was how familiar the progression felt. The insistence on appearance. The resistance to consequence. The belief that confidence could override reality indefinitely. I'd lived inside that structure long enough to recognize its limits. Once credibility fractures, effort accelerates its collapse. The new husband tried to stabilize things publicly. Posts increased. Declarations sharpened. Certainty was restated as if repetition could anchor it. Privately, the cracks widened. Alignment requires shared incentives, and those were never clearly defined. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt distant, like watching a building develop stress fractures long after you've moved out. The knowledge doesn't produce satisfaction, it just confirms why leaving was necessary. Eventually, explanations stopped working. Silence replaced them. Invitations declined. Conversations shortened. The narrative lost momentum because it no longer had material to sustain itself. I let it finish on its own. No guidance. No correction. Just gravity doing what it always does. By then, I was already elsewhere, physically and mentally, living inside a structure that didn't depend on illusion to stand. By the time everything settled, there was no single moment that marked the end. No phone call, no announcement, no apology that arrived too late to matter. Things simply reached a point where they could no longer pretend to be intact. That was enough. I didn't feel victory. That surprised people when they asked. The few still did. They expected satisfaction, some quiet acknowledgement that the arc had bent in my favor. But there was none of that. Victory implies competition, and I had stopped competing long before the outcome became visible. I didn't feel regret either. Regret requires wishing you'd acted differently, and I wouldn't change the way I moved through it. I stayed calm. I stayed clean. I didn't trade dignity for speed or clarity for drama. What I lost deliberately. What I kept mattered more. What I felt was relief. Not the dramatic kind that rushes in all at once, but the steady absence of pressure. The end of having to monitor tone, manage perception, or prove value through endurance. Relief showed up in small ways: sleep without tension, conversations without rehearsal, decisions made without anticipating someone else's reaction. I didn't offer explanations. I didn't correct narratives. People filled in gaps on their own, using whatever information made sense to them. That wasn't my responsibility anymore. The need to be understood had faded with the need to belong inside a structure that couldn't support honesty. When I left, I did it quietly. No speeches. No final conversations meant to tidy things up emotionally. Clean exits don't require commentary. They require timing and restraint. I closed accounts. I redirected energy. I simplified. Each step felt lighter than the last, like shedding weight I'd been carrying so long I'd mistaken it for muscle. There was no ceremony to it. Just distance increasing between who I had been and who I was becoming. That distance brought perspective, and perspective brought calm. I didn't walk away angry. I walked away finished. And that made all the difference. My life became quieter in ways I didn't know were possible before I lived them. There was no big reset, no announcement to mark the transition. Just mornings that started without tension in my chest. Evenings that didn't require decompression. Decisions that stood on their own, without rehearsal or justification. The absence of noise revealed how much of it I'd been carrying without noticing. I simplified everything. Work stayed focused and contained. Relationships became fewer, but sharper. I stopped explaining myself out of reflex. I stopped mistaking familiarity for safety. What remained felt real because it didn't ask to be managed. I learned the difference between appearance and foundation. Appearance needs constant attention. Foundation doesn't ask for validation, it just holds. For years, I've been propping up something that looked impressive but shifted under pressure. I won't do that again. Sometimes people ask if I'd ever go back. To her. To that version of my life. I don't answer directly, because the question misunderstands the change. There is no back once you've reorganized your life around truth instead of endurance. I don't carry bitterness. I don't carry nostalgia. What I carry is awareness, and the calm that comes with it. This time, I know exactly where I stand. And I'm not going back.